Okay, so tonight we're going to talk about Chapter 13. Chapter 13 deals with the spinal cord and the spinal nerves. The purpose of this chapter is to identify and describe the anatomical features of the spinal cord and the spinal nerves, discuss the function of the spinal cord and the spinal nerves, and understand how they help maintain homeostasis in the body, and then finally understand spinal reflex arcs. So there's processes for the reflexes, and then these integrate the EPSPs and the IPSPs, and you may remember those from the previous chapter when we were talking about action potential, and the EPSPs and the IPSPs relate to the graded potential, and it's just the way that the chemical reaction, the physiology where the nerve triggers the muscle to move or to react to a stimulus that's out in space. Well, when I say space, I just mean your immediate area or something internal that could happen and could trigger a response. So the other point is that they conduct sensory impulses to the brain and motor impulses to the effectors. And we'll talk more in detail about these as the lecture moves on. But first, we'll deal with the spinal cord anatomy, and I'm starting here on page 462, section 13.1, and then this is figure 13.1 on page 463. But the spinal cord is protected by bone, it's protected by connective tissue, and it's protected by fluid. So you can see here a cross section of a vertebrae. So this is a real life picture of one. So we're going to talk about this dura mater and this arachnoid mater and this pia mater that protect the spinal cord itself. It's right here, kind of in the center. So there's a lot of protection around this spinal cord. It's really just an extension of the brain. You'll see as we get into it how the gray matter and the white matter work, and as they move up the spinal column into the brain, how they kind of transition into that. I think that way too because as you'll see as the chapter unfolds, the reflex actions and the reflex arc, it's based on really the response of the spinal cord, because the things that will make you react, there's different kinds of reflexes we'll talk about, and if you have to stop and send a signal to the brain, well, that's going to take more time than it is just to react. So that's kind of the way that reflexes work, because it's just a very quick reaction. But these meninges are composed of 3 layers, and I already mentioned those on the previous slide. So let's go back. Remember, I was pointing these dura mater and the arachnoid mater and the pia mater out. Those are the names of the connective tissue that surround the spinal cord. So now here you see a cartoon of it. So here's your spinal cord right here, and this is going to be your gray matter, which I just mentioned, and then the white matter kind of surrounding it. So notice how the gray matter is sort of an H shape. And then you can see you've got these different layers of these outer or more superficial and middle, and then the pia mater is going to be more deep. And you can kind of see how they wrap around and protect the spinal cord. So the mater is still on page 462 there. This starts in the first column. So you can see there that if you look in the book, that these 3 items that we're talking about are nothing more than connective tissue that's designed to help cushion and protect the spinal cord. And so the spinal cord begins as an extension of the medulla oblongata at the level of the foramen magnum and terminates at the level L2. So when I talk about L2, remember back a few chapters how your spinal column is divided up into these different sections. So L2 just stands for like the lumbar part of your spine, which is essentially your mid to lower back. You can kind of see it here on the cartoon, and this is page 465, figure 13.2. The lumbar part of your spinal column is, here to your mid to lower back. That's what I was saying a few slides ago. It doesn't really say this in the book. It's just how I think of it, that the spinal cord is really just kind of an extension of the brain, that it goes down into the spinal column. And as I said, there's reasons for that, which I'll talk more in detail about as the lecture goes on. But, so I was getting at this. So the medulla oblongata is part of the brain. Well, obviously, we're not talking about the brain tonight, so we'll be talking about this in a subsequent chapter. But the medulla oblongata is the lowermost part of the brain that transitions into the spinal cord. And then you can see here that you've got your cervical section, and then your thoracic, and then the lumbar, and then the sacral and the coccygeal. So even though there's still nerves associated with the sacral and the coccygeal, as well as even the lower parts of the spinal column, see, it stops at L2. So there's still nerves associated with this part of the back. It's just the spinal cord is just stopping around here in this area. I guess that's the takeaway from this slide, is that the spinal cord does not go for the full length of the spine. So here we have kind of a detailed cartoon of the anatomy of the spinal cord, and you can see this on page 466, figure 13.3. So there's something that we call a fissure. So remember back when we were doing the skeletal system, and there's different kinds of features that the bone has. Being a fissure, it's kind of a little bit deeper of a groove here. Like, look at how deep this groove is going to go into the bone. So we call this a fissure. And this is how you could tell the anterior portion of the spinal cord, which also is going to translate into the vertebra. But this is actually looking inside of the vertebra at the spinal cord itself. So the anterior portion of the spinal cord has this pretty big fissure in the front. And then on the posterior side, got something that we call a sulcus, which is not nearly as defined as this feature is. And then, so we see here that this is the white matter. And then you can kind of see this H shape, or your book describes it as, quote unquote, a butterfly. I mean, I guess maybe I could see that. But to me, it looks more like an H. This is gray matter. And so remember back to the previous chapter that we did, the gray matter has no myelination on the nervous tissue, and then the white matter is myelinated. So therefore, this white matter is going to have the axons in it, and the gray matter is not going to have like axons, because remember, the axons are part of the nerve it's got the myelin on it. So you have to remember back to the previous chapter. So there's different characteristics for these, where the white matter, the signal, whatever signal is coming in, here's our spinal nerve right here. So there's a nerve, and then whatever signal is going into the nerve is either going to go through the gray matter or the white matter, and then what the signal through the white matter goes faster than it would in the gray matter. And that's due to the myelination. So looking at the same figure on page 466, figure 13.3, this is a little more clear than this cartoon, I think. But you can kind of see the white matter pretty clear here, and then this H-shaped gray matter. And this is just an image from a light microscope, 5 times magnified. And you can see here it shows you the cross section that we're looking at, this transverse plane here. So sensory and motor processing. So the internal anatomy of the spinal cord allows sensory and motor information to be processed in an organized way. So if you remember back to, I think it was chapter 1, maybe chapter 4. Remember, we skipped chapter 2 and 3. It's one of the early chapters, but remember we talked about a feedback loop, and this, your book doesn't say it directly, but when I look at this figure here, it reminds me certainly of a feedback loop. So you can follow the numbers here. Where's the number 1? Page 467, figure 13.4. Here's the number 1 right here. So this would be like your skin, and then you've got these sensory receptors in the skin that are going to get some kind of a signal, whether it's stepping on a tack or touching a hot stove, whatever the case may be. You're going to get some sensory input that's going to meet up with your skin, and that's going to send a signal through these receptors. And then these neurons convey the input in the form of nerve impulses. So then you get these nerve impulses traveling through the neurons into the spinal nerve ultimately. And then you can see here that depending on the type of stimulus that your body is encountering, it may affect the skeletal muscle or some of the other involuntary processes like the cardiac muscle, the smooth muscle, or glands. And then that may go a couple different ways here. You can see that you're going to get this signal that's going to go up to your brain, and then it's going to come back down and then out to the skeletal. So the skeletal muscle reacts, but doesn't necessarily have to. So you see here this interneuron, which is going to connect and give you what we would call a reflex. So it's kind of like a shortcut. That's why I say the spinal cord is really just an extension of the brain, because instead of sending the signal all the way up to the brain, it creates a shortcut, depending on what it is, and that will get you to react even faster. And it's still fast even if it goes to the brain, but sometimes if a signal is going to go to the brain, some stimulus is coming in, you may have to think about it. So there may be some thought process involved in it, where a reflex is more of just a reaction to whatever is coming towards you. And really, it's just kind of a defense mechanism to help you to avoid injury. So this table here starts on page 468. This is table 13.1. And the takeaway from this table is it's a comparison of various spinal cord segments. So remember a few slides back, we were talking about how each part of the vertebral column has these names. And you can see here that the ratio and the appearance of the white and gray matter changes throughout the course or throughout the length of the spinal column. So you can see the cervical versus the thoracic, and the lumbar and the sacral. So as the spinal cord gets more inferior to the brain, more inferior is what I'm saying. So as it gets farther away from the brain, the gray matter increases in that spinal cord. And then that's shown here on this table that we're looking at right now. Spinal nerves here at the bottom of page 468. Spinal nerves connect the central nervous system to sensory receptors, muscles, and glands, and are part of the peripheral nervous system. There are 31 pairs of spinal nerves. The anterior and posterior roots attach a spinal nerve to a segment of the spinal cord. So when I say there's 31 pairs of spinal nerves, so remember, if you take this median plane and you cut the body in half and look at it, the body's kind of like a mirror, right? Like look at my hands. They're basically mirrors of each other, right? So your spinal cord's kind of the same way. So you've got 31 spinal nerves on this side and 31 spinal nerves on this side, and that makes the 31 pairs of spinal nerves. So in all, there's going to be 62 spinal nerves, but we call them pairs because the one on the left or the right is going to serve the same purpose. So, the right-hand side may affect your right hand, where the spinal nerve coming out of the left-hand side is going to affect your left hand. Did I say that right? Did I call this my right hand or my left hand? On the right, it's going to affect the right side, and then on the left, it's going to affect the left side, in case I didn't say that right. Let's have a look at this at 13.5. 3 layers of connective tissue wrappings around protect the axons. The endoneurium surrounds an individual axon. The perineurium surrounds bundles of axons, and the epineurium surrounds the entire nerve. So you can kind of see here what I'm talking about, and this probably looks familiar to you here from chapter 12, because when we were talking about how nerves were constructed, we did see another structure like this. So this is just one of the spinal nerves. It's all that it is a nerve. So we've already looked at nerves in the previous chapter, and this is just one that is actually spinal nerve because it's connecting to your spinal cord. But here we see a cartoon of it, and we can see the different layers. Then when we look over here at the scanning electron microscope, so this is how it's going to really look in real life. So, this is actually from a real human body. And you can see here on this side the different layers. So a lot like the skin, the epi and the peri and the endo, that implies whether it's deep or superficial, etc. Page 470, figure 13.6. So shortly after passing through its invertebral foramen, a spinal nerve divides into several branches known as rami. Okay, so we kind of see here that there's different branches of a spinal nerve, and we call those rami, or one would be called, like, here's the anterior ramus. So that's the singular pronunciation of that word. And you can see here that there's different rami that go to different parts of the body and how the nerve branches off so it can reach all of the different places that it needs to give you some sort of sensory perception there. Now, this is a pretty cool figure here. I like this one. This is 13.7 on page 471. Certain segments of the skin are supplied by spinal nerves that carry somatic sensory nerve impulses to the brain. So this guy here, standing here on the side, is basically a map that shows you where each of the nerves go. So remember, C2, that's going to stand for cervical. So remember, the cervical part of your spinal column is here at the top, and the word cervical, really, all it means is neck. So the cervical nerves are up in this part of your spinal column. You can see where they're mapped to on the skin. In anatomical position, the radius is going to be on the side of the thumb, and then the ulna is going to be on the side of the pinky. And then we can see where our thoracic nerves go to. They affect a lot of the torso, and then also the inside of the arm. We can see where our lumbar nerves are working. So a lot of on the anterior part of the leg, a little bit on the posterior here. You can see up here at the top of the glute, some lumbar here in the back, but a lot of it is here on the front. And then we see this posterior side of the leg. We see the sacral nerves are affecting this quite a bit. And also the sacral nerves are also in touch with the genital portion of your body. And the sacrals are dealing with the bottom of your foot, and then also this outside part of your foot. So this is a neat slide that shows you where each of the spinal nerves and where they can kind of be located at in your skin or on your body. For the cervical plexus. The cervical plexus, this is 13.3 starting on page 471, and this is figure 13.8 on 472. So we talked about it here for a second. The cervical plexus is going to affect these parts of your body. So let's see what it says. This supplies the skin and muscles of the head, neck, superior portion of the shoulders, chest, and diaphragm. When you look at the spinal nerves, like if you went to a neurologist, for instance, and you were having a problem with something, or even probably even a general practitioner, if you're having some pain or some problem with your body, they're probably going to look at, is there something affecting the nerve? Because that's what's sending the signal for the pain. So it could be a nerve problem. You might have to go to a neurologist for that. So all of these different nerves here, so you can kind of see by how they're named, the supraclavicular. So this is going to go from the C4 vertebra, the C4 spinal nerve, the cervical 4, is going to go here to the clavicular, so the clavicle. And we talked about the clavicle when we did the skeletal system. So a lot of these names, you can kind of guess them anatomically. So we talked about our occipitals, so that deals with our eyes. And this one here, the phrenic, this is an important one because if you damage your phrenic nerve, you'll probably die, because the phrenic nerve deals with your diaphragm and helps you to breathe, because it's sensing when you need to inhale and exhale. And if you lose that nerve, if you no longer have that sense there, then you'll lose the ability to breathe and you'll basically die. So I'm not saying necessarily that any one nerve is more important than the other, but the phrenic nerve is a very important nerve. So here, this table is on page 472. So it just kind of goes through and gives you an overview of what these different nerves, where they're originating, and then what part of the body they're going to affect. So as you should know by now, on the quiz and exams, I often pull questions from these tables. So make sure you study those and become familiar with them. And I'll let you go through those on your own. So getting now to the brachial plexus. And this starts on page 473, and the figure here is on page 474, figure 13.9. This provides almost the entire nerve supply to the shoulders and the upper limbs. Again, we can see here that the brachial plexus is extending from C4 to T2. So let me just say as a disclaimer, there is a little bit of gray area in between the flanks of each of one of the plexes. This is plural for plexus, but as you'll notice, each one of these plexes that we go through, there's a little bit of overlap in them. So just something you should be aware of. But we can see here all of the different nerves and where they're going. I was talking about the radius a few slides ago and the ulna, and you can see here that the radial nerve is going to affect the radial side of the arm, and the ulnar nerve is going to affect the ulna side of the arm. All right, so that's just my point, that when you're going through these, like if you see it on a Quizzer exam, not always, but much of the time, you can tell by what they're named, what part of the body they're going to affect. And this is also the same figure, 13.9, but moving now to page 475, and now this kind of puts it into context for you. So you can see here that this plexus starts out a little bit superior to the shoulder, but then ultimately winds up inferior to the shoulder. And you can see here all these nerves and where they're going to in this part of the body, the arm. So this is just kind of showing some things that can go wrong with the nerve. If you have some nerve damage, then you can get this ulnar nerve palsy. So, that's going to give you it's going to have a hard time moving these two fingers if your ulnar nerve is affected. So that's all that this slide is showing, is that how different nerves have some damage or some problems that they may cause your hand to do certain things, and you may not be able to function correctly or as a normal person would function if there's nerve damage at that point. And again, the same table, well, not the same table, it's a different table, but the same idea, that you got the nerve, you got the origin, and then the distribution. So I like to pull questions from these tables, so make sure you study it. Lumbar plexus, starting on page 476, and this is figure 13.10. So we can kind of see where the lumbar plexus is located at in the torso, and the vertebra that it's associated with, and then each one of these, like here, genitofemoral. So that would tell you that it's in the area of the genitals, and it's close to the femoral. There's a femoral artery that's running up the inside of your leg. The femur is the largest bone in your body. So all of this stuff has to do with the upper leg. And this one in particular has to do with also the genital portion of that. And then we see another femoral nerve here. So this is just really just telling you where they're located at and kind of what they're doing, and what part of the body they're affecting. Same figure, but moving to page 477. So we see it in a little more detail here. Here's the genitofemoral nerve. It goes here. It looks like it ends about here. So yeah, I would think that this would be closer to the genital region, but it still is relatively close compared to these nerves down here. Here's a sciatic nerve. This is a popular one I've heard quite a bit about. So it's a long nerve that's running through your leg. Looks like a pretty major nerve. Here's your femur. I mentioned that on the previous slide. That's the largest bone in your body. And then you can kind of see the hip bone here and how the nerve kind of goes through the bone. Again, the same type of table here on page 476. So now we're on the sacral plexus. Your book combines the sacral plexus and the coccygeal plexus on page 478, but the PowerPoint is talking specifically about the sacral plexus. So again, we see the associated portion of the spine, each one of the spinal nerves associated with that, named respectively. And now we see that the nerves then are going out to wherever they're being distributed to. Okay, so here, the tibial, I can talk about that one. This nerve is going to go throughout the leg and is going to go down to the tibia, and it's going to be associated in that area of the body. So here we see the tibia right here, and I would wager that you've got the tibial nerve. Let's see, we got the sciatic nerve, and it looks like the once it gets down to the knee, it becomes the tibial nerve going down, and then you can kind of see how all of these nerves branch out through the upper part of the leg, and then the inferior part of the leg, and down into the feet. So the medial plantar nerve, yeah, it makes sense because we talked about that bone. So whatever the name of the bone is, or the area of the body, the nerve is going to be named after that 99% of the time. It's just like in Spanish, like you've got irregular verbs that just don't conjugate the way that most normal verbs do. So, but there's not as many of them as there are the regular verbs, right? So I kind of think of it the same way here. Most of these nerves are going to be named for their part of the body or the bone that they're associated with, but some of them may not be, but most of them are. Same table here, page 478 to 479. You can check that out. So now let's talk about the physiology of the spinal cord. And this begins on page 480. In order to maintain homeostasis, the spinal cord must propagate nerve impulses and integrate information. How does information travel in the spinal cord? White matter tracts conduct nerve impulses to and from the brain. Gray matter receives and integrates incoming and outgoing information to perform spinal reflexes. So I was hitting on this a couple times when we were talking about the gray and the white matter. And now the book or the PowerPoint defines it clearly for you that your reflexes are mostly associated with your gray matter, and then any signal that needs to go to the brain for processing is going to be associated with more of the white matter parts of your spinal cord. So we got a nice cartoon here on page 480, figure 13.12. We have a couple different things going on here. We have these sensory parts of the spinal cord here in blue. All right, and then you've got the motor parts of the spinal cord here in red. So the motor is mostly going to affect the skeletal muscle because you're going to get some sort of stimuli and your skeletal muscle is going to react however. So here's the spinal nerve. Remember, we were just talking about those, C1 through L2. There's a lot of different spinal nerves associated with the spinal column. And this is just kind of a generic cartoon of the spinal cord and its related tracts, either sensory or motor. So reflexes and reflex arcs. A reflex is a fast, involuntary, unplanned response to a particular stimulus. Reflexes help maintain homeostasis. The gray matter of the spinal cord serves as the integrating center for spinal reflexes. I was talking about this at the beginning of the lecture, that it reminds me of like a feedback loop that we saw at the beginning of the course. So you see here you've got some sort of sensor that's going to sense some stimuli, which just happens to be a tack. If you're barefoot in your house and somebody left a tack on the floor, or it fell off of maybe you had one in the wall that fell off or something, or you got kids that left one on the floor. However, a tack could get on your floor. You see that there, that it's going to get into your skin and cause some stimuli. And so what's it going to do? It's going to tell you to move your foot away. This is an example of a reflex arc. So you get the stimulus and you get this quick signal telling your effector, your skeletal muscle, to move, get out of the way. So just some basic vocabulary for the reflex arcs. You got the ipsilateral, which means same side, the contralateral, which means opposite side, the monosynaptic means one, the polysynaptic means more than one, and the reciprocal innervation is a neural circuit simultaneously contracting one muscle as it relaxes its antagonists. So we'll talk about that in the upcoming slides. So moving on then, we've got the stretch reflex. And this is illustrated for you on page 483, figure 13.14. So anybody who's ever had a physical has probably had the doctor do this to them, where they come in with this special mallet and they tap right below your patella, and that causes what we call the stretch reflex. So you can see that there's some stimuli there, and that's going to send a signal, and that's going to cause your muscle to stretch. And that's just because your body itself is trying to avoid injury. And since you've got that stimulus on that tendon, it's telling your muscle that it needs to stretch out to avoid injury. Really, when the doctor does that in the office, he or she's really just checking to make sure that your neural circuits are working properly. It's really all that it is. And you can see here that the foot is going to move out this way. The tendon reflex, on the other hand, is here on page 484, figure 13.15. The tendon reflex causes relaxation of the muscle attached to the stimulated tendon organ. So this is a way, if you were to tap above the patella, this tendon, then this could cause the foot to move posteriorly. Remember, on this one, below, it's moving out this way, and above, it's moving this way. And that's just called a tendon reflex. The flexor withdrawal illustrated for you on page 485, figure 13.16. The flexor reflex causes withdrawal of a part of the body in response to a painful stimuli. So this is getting back to a few slides ago when we were talking about stepping on a tack or a nail, whatever. When your body senses that, your reflex is a natural reflex to protect yourself. It's going to move that foot out of the way. I'm not going to step there. And now sometimes, you may be running or you may be doing something with force, and it may be too late by the time you step on the nail. I'm trying to think of an example. I've certainly stepped on nails before and stuff, and sometimes you don't even notice it until after it happens. But depending on what you're doing and how you're moving, you could sense that. If you're not running and not doing, if you're kind of like, it's late at night maybe, and you're getting up to get a glass of water, and you didn't turn on the lights because you don't want to wake up whoever else is in the house, so you're just kind of slowly moving your way through the kitchen, and kid or whoever leaves a tack on the floor or an accident, and you feel that, you can feel that because you're not really moving. But if you're running to get a glass of water, you've got a lot of other stimulus because you're putting more weight on each foot and you're moving faster, so it might take a little more time for your body to recognize that, hey, we need to stop and look at our foot because there's something sharp sticking in your toe now. So at that point, it may not be this quick reflex. It may have to go to the brain where you're thinking about it. And I just illustrated for you the thought process, right? Because you're running along and you step on something and you take another step as you're running and you're like, wait a minute, that doesn't feel right. It's went up through your spinal column to get to your brain. So now your brain's kind of involved in that reflex where your brain's saying, wait a minute, something's not right. I'm thinking about this. Something's not right in my foot. I'm running and there's some sharp pain in my foot right now. Why is that? Maybe I should stop and look. And yeah, sure, it might happen a little quicker than that. I'm just saying that depending on the circumstances and how you're moving and whatever stimuli you've got out here in space. I'm not talking about outer space. I'm just talking about the space that's around you. Whatever stimuli you got coming towards you, if there's more or less, you may be more sensitive or less sensitive when you step on that tack. And it's either going to go to that reflex arc that we're talking about, or you might have to take a minute to think about it and say, wait a minute, something's not right. Crossed-Extensor Reflex, page 487, figure 13.17. A crossed-extensor reflex causes contraction of muscles that extend joints in the limb, opposite of a painful stimulus. Actually, what this does is it helps you to maintain balance during a withdrawal reflex. So when you step on that tack, you've got some painful stimulus there. Well, if you're running or something and not running, let's say you're walking and you got some painful stimulus when you take a step, when you pull your foot back, if you just pull your foot, you could fall flat on your face, right? So what this crossed-extensor reflex does, it helps your body to say, hey, there's some painful stimulus there. I'm moving this foot back. I better put the other foot over there to keep my balance. It's kind of a response to the pain telling another part of your body, hey, I need some help over here. So it's telling your foot, you better move over to this place, wherever the place may be, so I can maintain the center of gravity so I don't fall flat on my face. So that's the idea behind that. And I wanted to say one other thing about that too. I think maybe we talk about this in the next slide. No, okay. So let's go back to this because I want to throw out another idea here, just to get you thinking a little bit. But your nerves also make it. So this is a really cool slide here, because when I get the pain stimulus and I move my foot back and my other foot goes out to catch myself and help me to balance. Well, it just shows you that with your nervous system, that's why I don't need to look. I can tell myself, touch my finger to my nose, right? My eyes are closed and I'm not squinting or peeking. I don't need to, right? Because my eyes are closed, and I can say, touch my nose, touch my ears. My nervous system is also giving me some spatial recognition that I don't even need to see. You know, I can tell, I can sense things with my nervous system. My spinal nerves, you know, they're coming out here in my arms, and I say, I touch your eyelid, right? Touch your eyebrow. The nerves also help you with your kind of your spatial thing. And I think it goes hand in hand with this slide, because let's say you got kids, right? And we all know how kids can be. You know, you go into their bedroom and it's just a big mess. And, you know, maybe they got some tack on their floor, but they got some toys around too. And you step on the tack and you pull your foot back and your other foot goes in, but then there's a toy there. So, you know, you got to kind of avoid and shift around. So, you know, your body can kind of sense all that stuff, and it gives you this like spatial awareness. And largely, you know, I can pretty much touch anywhere on my body. I don't even have to look. I know you can't see it, but I can say, touch my kneecap. So, you know, I can say, touch my left fingertip, index fingertip to my right kneecap, and it's no problem. I'm doing it right now. So something else, just I think it's amazing. The body, it can be so amazing with all of the things that it can do. Again, maybe it's something that we take for granted. Disorders of the spinal cord and the spinal nerves. So traumatic injuries, they can cause monoplegia, paraplegia, hemiplegia, and quadriplegia. This damage results from traumatic injuries depends on the degree of the spinal cord section or the degree of the compression of the segments involved. Anyway, this picture here is at page 488. And so you can kind of see there the letter A, so you can see there's no function from the neck down. Letter B, some arm and chest muscle control. Letter C, most thigh muscles. And then letter D, most leg muscles are affected. I know some people who are like paralyzed from the waist down because they broke their back at some point. To tell you the truth, I've never met a quadriplegic in my whole life. I know that there was a famous one, Christopher Reeve, who played Superman back in the 70s or the 80s. He became a quadriplegic because he was horseback riding and he got thrown off the horse and broke his back. And depending on where you break your back, then you may have more degrees. But really, when you break your back, it really depends on the spinal cord itself, because as long as your spinal cord's not severed or damaged, you should be okay. But I guess, you know, when you break your back, that's pretty much what happened. I do remember a kid, when I was a little kid, you know, growing up in my neighborhood, we used to climb trees a lot. And I remember there was one of the bigger kids, and he fell out of the top of a tree and broke his back. But he did not get any kind of paralysis, or he was lucky. Really, what it depends on is the degree of the injury and whether or not that spinal cord is damaged. Because if that spinal cord becomes damaged, then you can become one of these plegic that we were talking about. So another disorder with the nerves is the shingles. So this is actually caused by the herpes zoster virus, which it says right here. This is an acute affection of the peripheral nervous system caused by herpes zoster, chickenpox. So this causes pain, discoloration of the skin, and a line of skin blisters. So If you've had chicken pox later in life, the shingles may pop up. So let me give you a little bit of background on this. The herpes virus lives inside of your nervous system. And the herpes virus, herpes zoster in particular, we're talking about herpes zoster. There's a number of different strains of herpes out there. But herpes, whatever strain it is going to live in your nervous system. Herpes zoster, chickenpox is really just a form of the herpes. That virus gets in there and it's going to live inside of your nervous system. It's going to lie dormant. And who knows what stimuli? I mean, age, stress, environmental factors. There could be a number of things that stimulate that to reemerge as what we call shingles. But the point is that it lies dormant in your nervous system. So herpes is kind of a disease. It's a disease of the skin, obviously, but it's also a disease of the nervous system because it's going to live inside of your nervous system. Now, there are some techniques that have been getting more research attention. And one of them is that, you can actually use the herpes virus to treat things like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, diseases that actually affect the nervous system. Like if you've ever known anybody with Alzheimer's, it just, their brains being eaten away. I've seen cross sections of brains with and without Alzheimer's, and people with Alzheimer's, their brain is just like deteriorating away. So one of the ideas is that you could use some herpes virus you could transform that virus. In other words, you could put some sort of DNA or RNA in there and then use the nervous system to actually deliver it to where it needs to go. So, and they've done that with a few different diseases, treating a few. I know that they've had some success with it, but there is still much collaborative research that needs to be done. Another set of disorders here is the spinal cord compression, degenerate diseases, multiple sclerosis, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, and polio. So we talked about MS last week. It's where the myelin sheaths on your neurons are degrading, and it's causing problems sending signals down your axon. Polio is another virus. It was common back in like the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. I know one of our presidents had polio, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And I remember that Roosevelt, he got it swimming in some contaminated water. Okay, so that's the end of the slides for tonight.